Picture this. It's 1938, and Saudi Arabia is one of the poorest countries on earth. The population of about 7 million survives on whatever pilgrims spend visiting Mecca, and the Great Depression has crushed even that. Pilgrimages dropped from 100,000 annually to below 40,000. The kingdom is broke. King Ibn Saud has unified the territory through decades of military campaigns, but there's no money for development, no industry, no infrastructure. Just poverty and the shrinking revenue from religious tourism. Then, on March 4th, 1938, everything changes. Oil begins flowing from Dammam well number 7 at 1,440 meters depth. The well produces 1,585 barrels on its first day, increasing to 3,810 barrels within days. By October 1938, the Dammam field is confirmed as commercially viable, and the world's greatest economic transformation begins. Fast forward to today, Saudi Arabia has a sovereign wealth fund worth $913 billion. They've built one of the most modern infrastructures on Earth from nothing, and they've achieved something no other oil nation has managed. They made themselves absolutely untouchable. Hey, I'm Brandon, and welcome back to My Money Minute, the channel where I dive into topics related to money and wealth. All right, let's get into it. The story of how Saudi Arabia turned black gold into geopolitical invincibility is one of the most brilliant strategic plays in modern history, and it starts with a handshake on a warship in 1945. World War II had just ended, and President Franklin D. Roosevelt was exhausted. He'd been at the Yalta Conference with Stalin and Churchill, negotiating the post-war order. On his way home, he made an unexpected stop. On February 14th, 1945, Roosevelt met with Saudi King Abdul Aziz ibn Saud aboard the USS Quincy in the Suez Canal. This was the first meeting between a US president and a Saudi king, and it would reshape global power for the next 80 years. The meeting lasted over 5 hours. They discussed guaranteeing the kingdom's sovereignty, developing the Saudi army, ensuring independence of Arab countries under colonialism, and most importantly, oil relations. Roosevelt abstained from cigarettes and cocktails to honor the king's Islamic sentiments. They disagreed on Palestine, but both men understood they needed each other. The Americans needed oil, the Saudis needed protection. They forged the basis of a relationship that would define the next century: America's security guarantees for the kingdom in return for access to affordable energy supplies. But the real genius of Saudi strategy wouldn't become clear for another 3 decades. By the early 1970s, Saudi oil revenues were growing rapidly. In 1972, oil revenues totaled $2.8 billion, accounting for nearly 64% of GDP, 90% of government budget revenue, and over 90% of foreign exchange receipts. But Saudi Arabia was still just another oil producer. They had wealth, but not power. That changed on October 17th, 1973. Following the Yom Kippur War, OPEC oil ministers agreed to use oil to influence Western support of Israel. On October 19th, Libya proclaimed an embargo on oil exports to the US, Saudi Arabia, and other Arab states followed the next day. The impact was immediate and devastating. The price of oil quadrupled by 1974, from about $3 to nearly $12 per barrel. By December 1973, OPEC raised prices to $11.65 per barrel. The price shock shrank the U.S. economy by approximately 2.5%, increased unemployment and inflation, and spun the economy into severe recession from 1973 to 1975. For Saudi Arabia, oil revenues jumped 40-fold between 1965 and 1975, from $655 million to $26.7 billion. The embargo ended on March 18, 1974, after King Faisal reported that the United States was being more even-handed, and Kissinger promised to sell Saudi Arabia weapons previously denied. But the embargo had proven something crucial: oil could be weaponized. And that realization led to the most brilliant financial arrangement of the 20th century. In a series of meetings in 1974, U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and the Saudi royal family made a deal that would change everything. The terms were simple but powerful. The United States would offer military protection for Saudi Arabia's oil fields, provide weapons, and guarantee protection from Israel. In exchange, OPEC countries would sell oil only in dollars. Saudi Arabia would invest surplus oil proceeds in U.S. debt securities and the bond market. By 1975, all oil-producing nations of OPEC had agreed to price their oil in dollars and hold their surplus proceeds in U.S. government debt securities. This was the birth of the petrodollar system, and it was genius for both parties. For America, it created artificial global demand for dollars. Every country that needed oil, which was every country, needed dollars to buy it. This allowed the US to maintain artificially low interest rates and run deficits that would have destroyed any other nation's currency. For Saudi Arabia, it guaranteed American military protection and made them indispensable to the US financial system. They couldn't be invaded, sanctioned, or overthrown because doing so would threaten the dollar itself. In the second half of 1974, US officials worked at the highest levels to ensure that most Saudi oil revenues flowed to the US Treasury through various mechanisms. By the end of 1975, more than 6,000 Americans were engaged in military-related activities in Saudi Arabia. Saudi arms purchases for 1974 to 1975 totaled over $3.8 billion, and training missions and construction projects worth over $10 billion were underway. The Saudis were buying American protection with American dollars earned from selling oil that could only be purchased with American dollars. It was a perfect closed loop. And the weapons deals kept getting bigger. In 1981, the US sold Saudi Arabia AWACS aircraft as part of an $8.5 billion arms deal, the largest foreign arms sale in US history at that time. The package included 5 E-3 Sentry AWACS aircraft, 8 KE-3 refueling aircraft, 1,177 advanced Sidewinder missiles, and 6 KC-135 aerial refueling aircraft. In 2010, the U.S. announced a $60.5 billion arms sale to Saudi Arabia, trumping the AWACS sale as the biggest in American history. In 2025, the U.S. and Saudi Arabia signed a record $142 billion arms deal focused on military modernization, involving Lockheed Martin, RTX, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, and Palantir. But weapons deals were just one piece of Saudi strategy. The real genius was how they positioned themselves as the world's swing producer, and this is what no other oil nation has been able to replicate. Saudi Arabia invested billions in building and maintaining spare production capacity. They're the only country to do this on an ongoing strategic basis. The kingdom currently holds about 3 million barrels per day of spare production capacity, accounting for roughly 60% of all ISO spare capacity globally. According to the International Energy Agency, OPEC has 5.3 million barrels per day total spare capacity, with 3.1 million held by Saudi Arabia alone. Why does this matter? Because it makes Saudi Arabia the oil market's central bank. When there's a supply disruption anywhere in the world, Saudi Arabia can immediately increase production to stabilize prices. When there's too much supply, they can cut production to prevent price crashes. Between 1970 and the early 2010s, Saudi Arabia increased production by 1 to 2 million barrels per day on several occasions to maintain price stability. This gives them enormous influence over global oil prices and makes them indispensable to the global economy. The kingdom functions as insurance against price shocks for the entire world. And that insurance makes them untouchable. But maintaining spare capacity is expensive. Why would Saudi Arabia do it when other oil producers don't? Because they have unique advantages that make it feasible. Saudi oil reserves are close to the surface and on land, making extraction vastly more cost-effective than most other countries. They have unusually low-cost resources and large national infrastructure built specifically for this purpose. They've never suspended upstream investments. Even when oil prices tumbled below $30 in early 2016, they kept investing in maintaining capacity. This is the strategic discipline that separates Saudi Arabia from every other oil nation. And to understand just how unique this is, look at what happened to other countries with massive oil wealth. Venezuela has the world's largest proven oil reserves, even bigger than Saudi Arabia. Yet, Venezuela suffered complete economic collapse. When Hugo Chavez was elected in 1999, Venezuela produced 3.55 million barrels daily. By 2023, production had dropped to just 0.85 million barrels. Why? Decades of poor governance, government mismanagement, and the nationalized oil company PDVSA being used as a piggy bank. At least $70 billion was siphoned off through corruption. Venezuela failed to set up a sovereign wealth fund like Norway and Qatar. Their non-oil economy was negligible. Nearly every consumer good was imported. The country even struggled to pay the foreign company printing its banknotes. Here's the key difference. Although Venezuela has more oil reserves, most are offshore or far underground and considered dense, making extraction costs too high to be profitable with current technology. Saudi oil is cheap to extract because it's accessible. But extraction costs don't explain everything. Iran and Iraq both have substantial reserves and relatively accessible oil, yet both failed to achieve Saudi-style success. Iran faced decades of international sanctions after the 1979 revolution, wars, and political instability that prevented consistent long-term economic planning. Iraq suffered through the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, the Gulf War in 1991, international sanctions through the 1990s, the 2003 invasion, and years of civil conflict. They never had the stability required to execute long-term strategy. Nigeria, despite massive oil wealth, struggled with corruption, civil conflict in the Niger Delta, and complete inability to invest oil revenues productively. The pattern is clear. Oil wealth alone means nothing. It's what you do with it that matters. Saudi Arabia's success came from unique factors that other nations couldn't replicate: exceptionally accessible and low-cost reserves, strategic political leadership willing to maintain long-term relationships with the US, massive investment in oil infrastructure and spare capacity, prudent economic management through sovereign wealth funds, and consistent political stability under centralized monarchy. The transformation of Saudi wealth over 50 years is staggering. Fueled by enormous revenues from oil exports, the economy boomed during the 1970s and 80s. Vast development projects transformed the once underdeveloped country into a modern state. Per capita income peaked at $11,700 during the 1981 oil boom, fell to $6,300 in 1998 during a price downturn, then rebounded to $17,000 in 1999-2007. The Public Investment Fund, created in 1971, has grown into one of the world's largest sovereign wealth funds with $913 billion in assets as of 2024, growing 19% annually. PIF's cumulative real non-oil GDP contribution between 2021 and 2024 grew to $243 billion, representing 10% of the nation's non-oil economy. This is the payoff from 50 years of strategic discipline, not just wealth, but economic diversification and genuine power. But now, the system faces its greatest challenges. On March 26, 2018, China launched yuan-denominated futures contracts for crude oil. As of January 2025, several countries are using the petro-yuan, including Russia, Iran, Venezuela, Saudi Arabia itself, China, UAE, and Egypt. Chinese President Xi Jinping visited Riyadh in December 2022, meeting with the Gulf Cooperation Council to discuss purchasing Persian Gulf energy with China's currency, the renminbi. Saudi Arabia has joined Project mBridge, a Bank for International Settlements digital currency arrangement allowing immediate settlement among partner central banks in China, Hong Kong, UAE, Thailand, and Saudi Arabia, bypassing SWIFT entirely. Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 and similar UAE programs create natural alignment with Chinese capabilities in technology, construction, and renewable energy. The petro-yuan is real. The alternatives to dollar dominance are being built, and Saudi Arabia is positioning itself to benefit from a multipolar financial system. But here's why the petrodollar system has proven remarkably resilient despite these challenges. Saudi Arabia still needs US military protection. China can't provide the security guarantees that America can, at least not yet. The US Navy still controls global shipping lanes. American weapon systems are still the most advanced in the world. More importantly, China has capital controls that make their currency less attractive for international reserves. The yuan isn't freely convertible like the dollar, and despite all the talk of alternatives, the dollar still represents 57.8% of global foreign exchange reserves. The system hasn't collapsed because both sides still need it. America needs Saudi Arabia to maintain spare capacity and stabilize oil markets. Saudi Arabia needs American security guarantees and weapons. But the cracks are widening. The $142 billion arms deal in 2025 shows America is working hard to maintain the relationship. That's not the action of a confident party. That's the action of someone worried about losing influence. Here's the bottom line on Saudi Arabia's strategy. They took oil wealth that could have been squandered like Venezuela, turned it into geopolitical leverage through the petrodollar system, maintained that leverage through strategic discipline as the swing producer, and now they're positioning themselves to benefit regardless of whether the dollar or yuan dominates the next era. Venezuela is broke. Iran is sanctioned. Iraq is unstable. Nigeria is corrupt. But Saudi Arabia? They've made themselves absolutely essential to the global economy and, therefore, untouchable. That's not luck. That's 80 years of brilliant strategy executed with discipline that no other oil nation has matched. Thank you for watching My Money Mint.